What's going on? It's Fight Season MMA, and today I want to do a video on my top 10 best grapplers inside the UFC organization. These are the UFC fighters who I believe have the best ground game ability inside the UFC, and they can change the fight single-handedly on the ground. Thank you guys so much for watching the UFC content. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers, so please, if you guys enjoy the video, go down and hit that subscribe button because 98% of you guys are not subscribed. So please go down there and hit that subscribe button. It is easily the best way to support the channel, and it is free. So please go down there and subscribe. And if you guys are here, you probably want to see more MMA content. So while you're down there, please go hit the post notifications and turn that on. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let's jump right into the video of my top 10 best UFC grapplers. In my number 10 spot for my top 10 UFC grapplers, I have Brian Ortega, and Brian Ortega is an absolute monster on the ground, and the only reason that he is only at number 10 because he lacks that wrestling ability, but his jiu-jitsu is probably top 3 best in the UFC currently. Brian Ortega has some of the craziest submission abilities. You look at that fight against Alexander Volkanovski, and he was threatening that submission so hard in that fight. That mounted guillotine that he had on Volkanovski, I have no idea how Volk got out of that guillotine, but Brian Ortega possesses every single grappling ability except that really big wrestling game. But what is truly encouraging is look at this fight against Yair Rodriguez and his last one. His wrestling ability was getting better, and that he has implemented some wrestling that he took Brian Ortega to the ground and submitted him, I think, by Darce. I'm not 100% sure, but 100% Brian Ortega has some of the greatest Brazilian jiu-jitsu the UFC has ever seen, and T-City, if he implements the wrestling ability, would be 100% top 3 best grapplers on this in the UFC organization. And due to the lack of wrestling, Brian Ortega lands at number 10 on my top 10 best grapplers in the UFC right now. At number 9 best grapplers in the UFC, I have Arman Tsarukyan, and Arman Tsarukyan is such a good wrestler. He has such power in the ground game where he can be able to throw his opponents around almost and be able to get positions over them to where it is super dominant, and that a lot of people aren't going to be able to withstand that. You look at that Charles Oliveira fight where he was genuinely standing in the opponent and beating Charles Oliveira in some of the ground exchanges to where it was truly impressive to see Arman Tsarukyan do that. Now, kind of the opposite to Brian Ortega is Arman Tsarukyan has the wrestling game, but not exactly the greatest jiu-jitsu inside the UFC, but his jiu-jitsu is better than Brian Ortega's wrestling, and I think that his wrestling is a lot more dominant and can be enforced in a lot more different ways than someone like Brian Ortega's. But Arman Tsarukyan has some of the greatest wrestling in the UFC right now, and if he implements that in the right standpoint, he can 100% do whatever he wants to his next opponent. And it is something that is truly crazy to see of how Arman Tsarukyan can go in there, throw his opponents around, and get very dominant positions that can lead to ground and pound or even a submission win. But 100% Arman Tsarukyan is number 9 on my top 10 best grapplers list. At number 8 best grappler in the UFC, I have Kamaru Usman, and Kamaru Usman is one of the veterans in the wrestling department in the UFC. He has such good top control and such good ground and pound in the UFC organization that 100% he had to be on this list. And like I said, he's kind of like Arman Tsarukyan where he lacks that Brazilian jiu-jitsu in that department, but 100% Kamaru Usman has such good ground control and such good ground and pound that he 100% can finish fights and can determine the pace because of his ground game. You look at the Leon Edwards fight, the second fight, where besides that knockout in the 5th round that Leon got, Kamaru Usman was dominating with the wrestling department in the ground department. The only reason Leon got that takedown in the 1st round was because of a trip, not necessarily a general wrestling exchange. But Kamaru Usman was doing everything he wanted in that fight. He was controlling the ground game and controlling the wrestling department. And even in his fights against someone like Colby Covington, who was thought to be an amazing wrestler, he was able to withstand that because of his wrestling ground game and his jiu-jitsu in the department to be able to fend off the wrestling exchanges and the position swamps. But 100% Kamaru Usman is one of the greatest grapplers the UFC has ever seen. And yes, the only thing not putting him higher on this list is his lack of jiu-jitsu, but 100% Kamaru Usman is one of the greatest grapplers in the UFC organization currently. Number 7, I have Diego Lopez, and the reason that Diego Lopez is at number 7 is how fast this guy jumps on submissions. Diego Lopez is one of my favorite fighters to watch in the grappling department because he jumps submissions so fast. You look at his 5 days notice fight against Movsar Evloev, where he jumped knee bar, which is one of the craziest submissions to jump crazily, and that was absolutely insane. His fight with Gavin Tucker in Nashville was crazy because he jumped off. He was standing up and he jumped to get the triangle, to get the triangle, and then he switched to like a weird arm bar that I have never seen before and used Gavin Tucker's leverage against him to break his arm. That was absolutely insane. And even in this last fight against Dan Ige, he jumped submission so fast against Ige, and it's one of those things that Diego Lopez is improving in the striking every single thing, but you gotta understand that his roots is a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu fighter, and Diego Lopez jumping submission so fast is something that is so deadly in every single facet of the game. You just gotta worry that in the clinch, if you get to Diego, he can get some trip and jump submission immediately. And Diego's wrestling is a lot better than people think because he can control the ground game and he's super heavy on top, but Diego Lopez is just uncanny submission ability in the UFC is 100% what puts him at number 7 on this list above someone like Kamaru Usman, because at any time you are facing Diego Lopez, you are in threat of submission. The Dan Ige fight, he threw armbar, he threw darts, he threw rear naked choke at Ige, and it was out of the absolute blue. But 100% Diego Lopez is 100% validated at number 7 on this list. At number 6 on my list, I have Merab Dvalishvili, and Merab has such power and such cardio that really aids him in the ground game. You look at that fight against Peter Yan that Merab Dvalishvili had, and he was beating the dog out of Peter Yan just because he was so relentless with that wrestling takedown ability. And yes, he doesn't quite have the jiu-jitsu as someone like a Brian Ortega, but he is so dominant in the UFC bantamweight division that if you get on the ground with Merab Dvalishvili, the fight is pretty much over. He is that dominant, and it is something that really aids Merab in every single fight that he has in the UFC bantamweight division. There is not one fighter in that division that can 100% stand with Merab in the wrestling department, and I think training with Aljamain Sterling, someone who is a great jiu-jitsu and a great wrestling opponent, is really helping Merab in every single facet, going up against some of these big bantamweights who have some wrestling defense, but Merab is like a buzzsaw going through this bantamweight division as a wrestler. He can take any opponent down he wants, and even against Henry Cejudo and an Olympic gold medalist wrestler, he just threw him across the octagon and picked him up and walked to him just to go see Dana White or Mark Zuckerberg, my fault, and just throw him down there. But ultimately, Merab Dvalishvili lands at number 6 on my list, and Merab is one of the greatest wrestlers the UFC has right now. At number 5 on my greatest grapplers list in the UFC right now, I have Aljamain Sterling, and Aljamain Sterling is kind of like Merab, where he possesses his wrestling game isn't as prominent as Merab's, but Aljamain Sterling is the human backpack. Aljamain Sterling has an uncanny ability to take the back immediately to finish fights. Aljamain Sterling made his money in the UFC bantamweight in his title reign, possibly making him the greatest UFC bantamweight of all time, because he was able to take the back so quickly to get some crazy submissions. And yes, I know the fight against TJ Dillashaw had his shoulder pop out, but Aljamain Sterling, the way he was controlling that fight, taking back, beating him by ground and pound, was absolutely insane. In the Henry Cejudo fight, when Aljamain Sterling took Henry Cejudo down in the first round, you could see the fear on Henry Cejudo's face to understand that he was getting absolutely demolished in the grappling department because of how good Aljamain Sterling's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is, complemented by a very good wrestling game. Aljamain Sterling has one of the most well-rounded ground games currently in the UFC, and 100% Aljamain Sterling deserves to be number 5 on my top 10 best grapplers in the UFC list. At number 4 best grappler in the UFC, I'm going to have Khamzat Chimaev, and Khamzat Chimaev is an absolute force to be reckoned with in the grappling department. You look at his fights with Kevin Holland, his fight with Li Jingliang, his fight with Kamaru Usman. Khamzat Chimaev has such dominance in the grappling department, where he has that wrestling ability and has enough jiu-jitsu skill to be able to take the back and to threat submissions on these different fighters. He absolutely killed Kamaru Usman in that grappling department, but as the fight went on, Khamzat Chimaev really wasn't able to take Kamaru Usman down because that gas tank is so bad. Khamzat Chimaev if he had an amazing gas tank, would be 100% the best grappler inside the UFC organization right now. But 100%, Hamzat Chimaev has such dominant positions and such dominant skills to where he can go out there and out-grapple any single person inside the UFC in that first round. And that's why I have Hamzat Chimaev at number 4 on this list. And I can't have him higher because of that lack of cardio that really hampers his ability from going long distances in the UFC. But if you talk about first round Hamzat Chimaev, he can out-grapple any single opponent inside the UFC. And that's what lands him at number 4 on my list. And at number 3 on my list is someone that you might not understand why I have him this high, but I have Sean Brady at number 3 on my list. And if you've watched Sean Brady fight, he has such good grappling ability. He is 100% my favorite grappler in the UFC to watch. The way he beats opponents to different positions before they try to get there. That Kelvin Gastelum fight, and I understand Kelvin Gastelum isn't the greatest on the ground, but Sean Brady was having an absolute masterclass on the ground, and he made it look easy just being able to beat Kelvin Gastelum to positions that he was trying to go to. Kelvin was trying to get up against Sean Brady, and he was going to these positions to where Sean Brady almost met him there to stop the position from even taking place of him allowing to get up. And Sean Brady has some of the nastiest submission skills inside the UFC. That Kelvin Gastelum fight, he was threatening with rear naked chokes. He was threatening with other different submissions, and he ended up getting one of the nastiest Kimuras I have ever seen inside the octagon. That Kimura against Kelvin Gastelum was up there against the Kimura, Islam Makhachev's Kimura against Dan Hooker. But 100% the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and the wrestling of Sean Brady is 100% one of the most well-rounded in the UFC right now, and that is why I have him at number 3 on the list. If you think that this ranking is really high, please go watch this fight against Kelvin Gastelum versus Sean Brady at UFC Austin last year. It was one of the most impressive grappling performances I had ever seen, and that performance and Sean Brady's well-rounded grappling and well-rounded jiu-jitsu lands him on the list at number 3. At number 2 on my list, I have Charles do Bronx Oliveira. Charles Oliveira has some of the best jiu-jitsu the UFC has ever seen. The way he can jump submission, the way he can take you down is absolutely insane. And to really complement his grappling game is that striking game. You look at that Justin Gaethje fight where he knocked Justin Gaethje just down so hard. And what did he do after? He didn't try to do ground and pound. He jumped on the back to threaten submission immediately, and that makes Charles Oliveira such a dangerous fighter because of how he can just automatically threaten submission. During Charles Oliveira's title run, no one wanted to ground and pound Charles Oliveira because that meant going into the guard of Charles Oliveira, and he has such a deadly guard and such a deadly submission game off of his back that no opponent wanted to test themselves against Charles Oliveira. And he has outgrappled some of the best UFC lightweights currently. That fight against Arman Tsarukyan at UFC 300 had some crazy back and forth ground exchanges where Charles Oliveira was getting some of the best out of Arman Tsarukyan in that fight. In that first round, he jumped guillotine immediately. In that last round, he hit darts on Arman Tsarukyan, which showed me that Charles Oliveira was out grappling Arman Tsarukyan in that fight. But 100%, Charles Oliveira is one of the most fun submission artists in the UFC. He has the most submissions in UFC history, and his striking game really aids him in the grappling department. That Dustin Poirier rear naked choke and some of these other crazy finishes. Charles Oliveira is such a fun fighter to watch and such a good grappler, and that's why he lands at number 2 on my list. And at number 1 on my list, it should not be a crazy feat. I have Islam Makhachev. And Islam Makhachev, coming from that Sambo wrestling background, is the greatest wrestler in the UFC right now. And what's absolutely insane is you have someone that good in the wrestling department who has such good technique in the jiu-jitsu department as well that he can threaten submissions instantly when it happens. You look, and his striking is better than Charles Oliveira, in my opinion, but you look at that fight against Charles Oliveira the first time at UFC 280 in Abu Dhabi, where he knocked Charles Oliveira down and he jumped on arm triangle immediately, and that squeeze must have been so tight because Charles Oliveira tapped like 30 million times, and it was almost immediately. In that Dustin Poirier fight, the way in that first round, he was kind of looking like he was going to switch to mount in that first round to where he was getting the submission victory. He was trying to switch to mount to isolate an arm for an armbar, and that is something that I haven't seen inside the UFC. And Islam Makhachev, you can tell, is thinking miles ahead of his opponents to get these different submission opportunities over them. And then later in that round against Dustin Poirier, or in that fight against Dustin Poirier, in that 5th round, he had an ankle pick, which was absolutely beautiful. And then that it threw Dustin Poirier off, made Islam Makhachev go jump guillotine and then jump Darce choke to ultimately tap Dustin Poirier out and put him to sleep in that final round. Islam Makhachev has some of the greatest wrestling the UFC has ever seen, and he is an absolute deadly submission artist. You look at the Dan Hooker submission and some of these other fights that Islam Makhachev has. Islam Makhachev is the greatest grappler in the UFC right now, and there's no debate. He is an absolute force to be reckoned with, and if anyone fights Islam Makhachev, you got to do your absolute best to stay off the ground with him. 100%, Islam Makhachev is the best, #1 top grappler in the UFC right now. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode of Fight Season MMA, and please let me know what you think about my top 10 grapplers list. If you guys have an opinion, please go down, leave a comment down below. I do my best to respond to comments as fast as possible, so please go down there and leave a comment down below on the video. Also, we're on the road to 1,000 subscribers, so please hit that subscribe button. The best way to support the channel is hitting that subscribe button. I know 98% of my viewers don't subscribe, so please don't be one of those 98 and be one of those 2% and go down and hit that subscribe button so you guys can show your support on the UFC video. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode of Fight Season MMA, and I will come back with you guys with more UFC news content very, very soon. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys later.